I still remember the first thing I shouted that morning. Why is there a plane landing in my cornfield? At first, I honestly believed I was watching an emergency. The low roar of the engine rolled across my property just after sunrise, scattering birds into the pale orange sky as I dropped the coffee mug I had been carrying across my porch. The aircraft came in surprisingly low, lined up perfectly with a long strip of flattened grass running through the middle of my western field, then touched down so smoothly that the pilot barely bounced before taxiing toward a cluster of parked pickup trucks I had never noticed from that angle. I stood there frozen. My family had owned this farm outside Cedar Ridge for only 6 months after I purchased it from the estate of an elderly rancher who had retired to Arizona. I had already walked every fence line, inspected every irrigation ditch, and memorized nearly every acre of the 600 acres I now called home. There was no airport on my property. There was no agreement allowing aircraft to use my land. There certainly was no reason for a single-engine airplane to be casually rolling across my field like it happened every Saturday morning. Before I could reach my truck, another pickup pulled alongside the airplane. 2 men climbed out laughing, unloaded golf bags from the baggage compartment, and waved toward the pilot like old friends finishing a routine commute. Nobody looked surprised to see an airplane sitting in my field. The only surprised person was me. I drove across the pasture as fast as the uneven ground allowed, and stopped about 50 yards away. The pilot climbed out wearing sunglasses and smiled as though I had arrived to welcome him. "Morning," he said. "Bit early today." I stared at him, waiting for the apology that never came. "You're on my property," I finally replied. His smile faded only slightly before he shrugged. "No, this is the HOA strip." I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. "There isn't an HOA anywhere on my land." He looked confused now instead of confident. "We've been landing here for years." Before I could answer, another SUV approached, this one polished so carefully it reflected the morning sun like a mirror. The driver's door swung open, and a woman stepped out wearing an expensive floral jacket, oversized designer sunglasses, sparkling jewelry, and enough confidence to make it seem as though she owned the county. Brenda Whitmore, the president of the neighboring homeowners association, walked directly toward me without introducing herself. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I'm glad you're finally here. We've been trying to reach the previous owner for ages." I folded my arms. "You could have started by not landing airplanes on my farm." She smiled politely, but it never reached her eyes. "This airstrip has served our community for 4 years. Everyone understands that." "I don't," I answered, "because it's my land." She gave a small laugh, almost amused. "Ownership is more complicated than that." Those 6 words bothered me more than anything else she said. Ownership was not complicated. I had a recorded deed, title insurance, county tax records, and survey documents sitting inside a filing cabinet less than 500 feet away. I paid every property tax bill. I maintained every fence. I carried every insurance policy. Nothing about my ownership felt complicated until a complete stranger arrived by airplane and another stranger insisted my field somehow belonged to her neighborhood. Brenda glanced toward the pilot and casually told him he could continue because everything was under control. That sentence made something click inside my head. She was not asking permission. She genuinely believed she already had it. I watched the pilot unload his bags before climbing into a waiting SUV that disappeared toward the gated HOA entrance nearly 2 miles away. As the airplane sat quietly in my field, I noticed something I had somehow overlooked before. The grass wasn't naturally worn down. There were hundreds of tire marks running perfectly parallel across the strip, fresh rubber streaks mixed with older faded tracks, all layered on top of one another. This wasn't an isolated mistake. Aircraft had been landing here over and over again. I drove straight back to my house, unlocked the cabinet containing every closing document from the purchase, spread the county survey across my kitchen table, and slowly traced the western property line with my finger until it crossed the exact stretch of land where the airplane now sat. My stomach dropped because the survey confirmed what I already suspected. Every single foot of that so-called airstrip was sitting squarely inside my property boundaries. I barely slept that night because every time I closed my eyes I pictured that airplane rolling across my field as if my property had been borrowed without anyone bothering to ask. By sunrise, I already had every closing document spread across my dining room table alongside my laptop, county tax maps, and the survey I had received when I bought the farm. I checked each page again, hoping I had somehow missed an easement or an agreement hidden in the paperwork, but there was nothing. The western field belonged entirely to me from the fence line near the creek all the way to the old oak grove at the northern edge. There was no recorded airport, no aviation easement, no lease, and no right of access granted to any homeowners association. Instead of confronting Brenda again, I decided to let documents speak louder than arguments. I drove to the county recorder's office after breakfast and requested every public record connected to my parcel over the past 10 years. The clerk recognized the property immediately because it had remained in the same family for decades before the recent estate sale. She handed me a stack of recorded deeds, subdivision maps, and survey revisions. After nearly an hour of reviewing everything at one of the public tables, I reached the same conclusion I had reached in my own kitchen. Nothing had ever transferred ownership of that field. Nothing had ever granted permission for aircraft operations. The land had remained private the entire time. On my way home, I hired a licensed survey company to verify every boundary with modern equipment. The lead surveyor listened carefully while I explained what had happened, then paused for a moment before asking a question that surprised me. "Did you say airplanes have been using that field regularly?" I nodded. He shook his head slowly and replied, "If that is true, you are going to want every measurement documented very carefully." 2 days later, bright orange flags began appearing across my western pasture while the survey crew worked with satellite receivers and precision equipment. I stayed out of their way, watching from a distance as they marked every corner and property line. Late that afternoon, the surveyor walked over carrying a rolled map under one arm. He spread it across the hood of my truck and pointed directly at the long strip of flattened grass. "There is no question," he said. "Every inch of this runway sits inside your property." Hearing another professional confirm what I already knew felt reassuring, but it also raised a much larger question. How had this gone on for 4 years without anyone noticing? Curious, I launched my drone the following morning and flew slow passes over the entire field. From 200 feet above, the answer became obvious. The grass runway was not temporary at all. It had clearly been maintained with remarkable consistency. The edges were trimmed evenly, tire tracks formed distinct taxi paths, and several painted ground markers had faded almost completely into the soil. Someone had invested years of work maintaining something that never should have existed on private farmland. Even more surprising, the drone captured a narrow gravel road leading from the runway directly toward the gated entrance of Brenda's neighborhood. The connection was impossible to ignore. That afternoon, I made one more phone call, this time to the regional aviation office. I explained that I was trying to determine whether a private landing strip had ever been officially registered on my property. After verifying my address, the representative searched their records for several minutes before returning to the line. "We do not show an approved airport, registered private airstrip, or recorded landing facility at that location," she explained politely. "If aircraft have been operating there, we would recommend documenting everything carefully." I thanked her and ended the call without mentioning Brenda or the homeowners association. The less I said now, the better. As the sun dipped below the trees that evening, I stood beside the western fence watching the empty field stretch across the horizon. It looked peaceful again, but now I noticed details I had overlooked before: faint wheel marks disappearing into the grass, old reflective stakes tucked near the edges, and a weathered windsock mounted on a pole just beyond the tree line. It blended into the landscape so naturally that I could not believe I had missed it during my first months on the property. Someone had built an entire aviation operation quietly enough that a new owner could mistake it for ordinary farm equipment. Then my phone buzzed with an email from the survey company attaching the certified boundary report. The final page contained a single sentence that would change everything. The entire landing strip, including every marked approach and access point, was located exclusively within the legal boundaries of my property. The certified survey answered the question of ownership, but it also created a much bigger mystery. If the runway had been entirely inside my property for years, then someone had been making money from land they never owned. That possibility refused to leave my mind. So instead of driving tractors across the western field, I spent the next several days following paperwork instead of tire tracks. My first stop was the county tax office, where I requested historical records connected to both my parcel and the neighboring homeowners association. Every tax payment tied to my field had been made by the previous owner and later by me after the purchase. The homeowners association had never paid a single dollar in taxes on that acreage. That discovery eliminated another possible explanation. They were not acting like people who believed they owned the land. They were acting like people who hoped nobody would ever question what they were doing. I decided to look beyond government records and started researching the homeowners association itself. Their public website proudly advertised a quiet community with premium amenities, scenic walking trails, and convenient access for recreational pilots. That final phrase immediately caught my attention. Recreational pilots. There was even a photograph of a smiling couple standing beside a small airplane, although the background had been cropped tightly enough that no recognizable landmarks appeared behind them. I searched deeper through archived newsletters and community announcements. Several years of event calendars mentioned fly-in breakfasts, charity aviation weekends, and neighborhood gatherings for aircraft owners. None of them identified where those airplanes actually landed. It was as though everyone involved intentionally avoided naming the location. Curious, I attended a Saturday breakfast at a small diner a few miles from my farm where local pilots often gathered. I introduced myself simply as the new owner of the Mercer farm and listened far more than I spoke. Before long, an older pilot smiled and asked, "How is the runway holding up these days?" I looked at him calmly and answered, "That is exactly what I am trying to figure out." His expression changed instantly. He explained that pilots had been told the strip belonged to the neighboring community and that permission had been arranged years earlier with the landowner. Several others around the table nodded in agreement. None of them believed they were trespassing. Every landing fee, every community event, and every reservation had been handled through the homeowners association. Nobody questioned it because everything appeared organized and professional. I thanked them for their honesty without accusing anyone of wrongdoing. By the time I left the diner, I realized the pilots were probably not the real problem. They had relied on information they believed was accurate. My attention shifted back to Brenda and the people managing the homeowners association. Later that afternoon, I reviewed satellite imagery available through public mapping services. Year after year, the runway became more defined. Fresh mowing patterns appeared every season. New gravel was added beside the landing area. Parking spaces gradually expanded. Portable signs came and went. The changes suggested continuous maintenance rather than occasional use. Someone had invested time and money into improving an airstrip that stood entirely on private farmland. Then another detail caught my eye. During one image captured less than a year before I purchased the property, 3 fuel trucks were parked near the edge of the runway beside temporary storage tanks. Whatever operation had existed, there was much larger than a handful of weekend landings. That evening, my attorney, Daniel Brooks, arrived at my house carrying a notebook instead of a briefcase. I handed him the certified survey, the tax records, printed satellite photographs, and copies of the Homeowners Association newsletters. He read quietly for several minutes before leaning back in his chair. "Cole," he said carefully, "do not contact Brenda again. Do not block the runway. Do not threaten anyone. From this moment forward, let them continue exactly as they have been." I frowned because his advice sounded completely backward. He smiled slightly and tapped the growing stack of documents between us. "Every ordinary day they continue operating on your property creates another ordinary day of evidence, and evidence is always more valuable than arguments." Daniel's advice sounded almost impossible to follow because every instinct told me to drive a tractor across the runway and place a fence directly in front of the next airplane. Instead, I did exactly the opposite. I treated every landing like another page being added to a file that was quietly growing stronger every day. The following Monday, I installed several security cameras on my own property, making certain they faced only my land and remained clearly visible from the driveway. I wanted accurate records, not surprises. Each camera automatically stamped every recording with the date and time, creating a reliable timeline of every arrival and departure. I also launched my drone every few mornings, capturing wide aerial photographs from the same altitude so the condition of the runway could be compared week after week. The changes were surprisingly easy to spot. Fresh tire marks appeared after busy weekends. New mowing patterns showed exactly how often the strip was maintained. Even the parking area beside the grass runway slowly expanded as more vehicles gathered during flying events. None of those improvements had been authorized by me, yet they continued as though someone else had assumed complete control over my western field. Daniel introduced me to a licensed forensic survey consultant who specialized in documenting long-term land use disputes. Unlike the first surveyor, this expert was less interested in property corners and far more interested in physical evidence. He photographed every worn section of grass, measured wheel impressions, identified areas where soil had been compacted over years of repeated aircraft traffic, and even noted where temporary utility markers had once been installed. When he finished, he quietly said, "This did not develop by accident. This required continuous maintenance over a long period of time." That single sentence carried far more weight than any emotional argument ever could. Meanwhile, I kept my daily routine as normal as possible. I harvested hay, repaired fences, and spoke politely with neighbors whenever they stopped by. Many of them assumed I had known about the runway before buying the property. When I explained that I had discovered it only after watching an airplane land in my field, several looked genuinely shocked. One retired farmer even admitted he had always believed the previous owner had leased that portion of the land to the homeowners association. "Nobody ever questioned it," he said. "It just became normal." His comment stayed with me because it explained how something so unusual could survive for years. Familiar routines often escaped scrutiny simply because everyone believed someone else had already checked them. By the second week, the security cameras had recorded 7 separate landings involving 5 different aircraft. Every pilot behaved respectfully, parking neatly before leaving with passengers waiting in vehicles from the neighboring community. None of them crossed my fences or caused damage beyond using the runway itself. The recordings reinforced what Daniel had suspected from the beginning. The pilots believed they had legitimate permission. They were following directions given by someone else. The responsibility rested with the people operating the facility, not necessarily those using it. Then another unexpected piece of evidence appeared without anyone asking for it. A landscaping truck arrived one Thursday morning carrying commercial mowing equipment. The crew trimmed the entire runway, removed weeds along both edges, and replaced several faded reflective markers before driving directly through the private entrance leading toward Brenda's neighborhood. My cameras captured every minute of the work, including the company logo painted across the side of the truck. I never approached the workers because there was no need. Their routine maintenance spoke for itself. That evening, Daniel reviewed the footage in my living room before closing his notebook with a satisfied smile. "We are no longer proving that airplanes landed here," he said. "Now we are documenting that someone has been actively managing this property as though they owned it." At that moment, I realized our case was no longer built on assumptions. It was being built one ordinary day at a time by the very people who believed nobody was watching. By the third week, I had settled into a routine that felt strangely peaceful on the surface and intensely deliberate underneath. Every airplane that landed became another timestamp. Every maintenance visit became another photograph. Every ordinary Saturday added another layer to a record that was becoming impossible to dismiss. Daniel continued reminding me that patience was saving us from making expensive mistakes. "The strongest cases are usually the quietest at the beginning," he told me more than once. I finally understood what he meant when a certified letter arrived at my mailbox bearing the return address of the Homeowners Association. Inside was a formal notice claiming that my recently installed cameras created an uncomfortable atmosphere for community members using what the letter described as the association's established aviation facility. I read that sentence 3 times before laughing. They had just put in writing that they believed they were operating an aviation facility. There was no mention of asking permission. There was no attempt to explain a lease or easement. Instead, the letter demanded that I remove the cameras because they interfered with the enjoyment of their members. Daniel smiled the moment he finished reading it. "Do not answer," he said. "This is exactly the kind of document we hoped they would create." A few days later, Brenda herself drove onto the gravel road leading to my barn. She stepped out wearing another expensive outfit that looked better suited for a country club than a working farm. She did not ask whether it was a convenient time to talk. She simply walked toward me with the confidence of someone expecting immediate agreement. "Mr. Mercer," she began, "our board believes we can resolve this misunderstanding without unnecessary legal expenses." I leaned against the fence and waited. "Your cameras make our residents uncomfortable," she continued. "Several pilots have mentioned feeling watched. I answered calmly. They are on my property. They record my property. She folded her arms. The runway has been part of our community for years. The deed says otherwise, I replied. Her expression tightened for only a moment before returning to the same practiced smile. Paperwork is not always the whole story. I almost reminded her that recorded property deeds exist for exactly that reason, but Daniel's advice echoed in my mind. Let them keep talking. Brenda continued explaining that the Homeowners Association had invested substantial money maintaining the landing area and improving access for residents. Every sentence she spoke unintentionally confirmed another fact we had already begun documenting. She admitted maintenance had been scheduled regularly. She mentioned annual improvements. She even referred to community aviation events held every season. None of those statements helped her position because every improvement had occurred on land that public records identified as mine. Before leaving, she handed me another envelope containing a proposal from the association's attorney. The document requested that I sign an agreement recognizing continued use of the runway in exchange for what they described as a reasonable annual payment. The amount offered would not have covered a fraction of the value generated by years of unrestricted access. More importantly, accepting it would have implied that the previous unauthorized use no longer mattered. Daniel reviewed the proposal later that afternoon and quietly placed it beside the earlier letter. Now we know something important, he said. If they truly believed they owned the property, they would never ask you to sign a use agreement. That observation changed the way I viewed everything Brenda had said. The confidence she displayed in person was beginning to look less like certainty and more like negotiation. Meanwhile, the activity at the runway increased instead of slowing down. Another community fly-in weekend brought more aircraft than I had seen since discovering the Strip. My cameras captured every arrival, every departure, every maintenance truck, and every vehicle entering through the neighborhood gate. Nobody realized that each ordinary weekend was adding page after page to a growing file that would soon tell a story far more convincing than any argument ever could. The weekend after Brenda's visit turned out to be the busiest one yet. Before 8 o'clock on Saturday morning, my cameras had already recorded 3 separate arrivals, and by noon the parking area beside the grass runway was filled with sport utility vehicles and pickup trucks carrying families headed toward the neighboring community. From a distance, it looked like a perfectly organized neighborhood event. If I had not owned the land beneath every tire and every airplane wheel, I probably would have assumed the same thing everyone else did. Daniel came to the farm shortly after lunch, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because he wanted to see the operation with his own eyes. We watched quietly from the edge of my hay field as another small airplane touched down, taxied smoothly across the worn grass, and parked beside a temporary row of orange safety cones. Volunteers wearing matching shirts greeted the pilot, directed traffic, and even helped unload coolers and folding chairs. Everything looked practiced. Everything looked routine. That was exactly why it mattered. Daniel reminded me that carefully organized activity usually left behind carefully organized records. Somewhere, he said, there are invoices, schedules, maintenance logs, emails, insurance policies, or meeting minutes. Operations this consistent do not happen by accident. His words stayed with me long after he drove away. Early the following week, Daniel called with the first significant development since we began documenting everything. He had submitted formal requests for several publicly available county records connected to permits, land use, and infrastructure surrounding the neighboring subdivision. Most of the responses simply confirmed what we already knew, but one agency replied that no county authorization had ever been issued for constructing or maintaining an aviation facility on my parcel. Another office confirmed that no recorded easement existed connecting the Homeowners Association to the runway. None of those findings automatically resolved the dispute, but together they painted an increasingly consistent picture. The runway existed physically, yet the paperwork supporting its existence appeared remarkably thin. 2 days later, another unexpected visitor arrived. A representative from an insurance company knocked on my front door after seeing my property while reviewing aerial photographs connected to a routine commercial policy evaluation in the area. He politely asked whether I owned the western field. When I answered yes, he explained that his company had insured certain activities associated with the neighboring community for several years and wanted to verify recent information concerning property ownership. I answered only factual questions and showed him the certified survey without offering opinions about anyone involved. He thanked me, made several notes, and left without revealing anything further. After he drove away, I immediately called Daniel. He sounded pleased rather than surprised. Independent questions usually mean other people have started comparing documents, he said. That is often how larger issues begin to surface. During the following weekend, something changed for the first time since I had discovered the runway. Two airplanes approached from the south, circled the field once, then climbed away without landing. A third aircraft landed normally, but the pilot spent several minutes speaking with volunteers before departing again much sooner than expected. My cameras captured every moment, including several people pointing toward the survey markers that still bordered the edge of my field. Rumors, it seemed, were beginning to travel faster than airplanes. On Monday morning, I noticed fresh tire tracks leading to the Homeowners Association office instead of the runway. By late afternoon, Brenda drove past my farm without stopping, something she had not done since trying to persuade me to sign the proposed agreement. Her confidence no longer appeared effortless. Even from the road, she seemed distracted, glancing repeatedly toward the western field before continuing through the subdivision entrance. That evening, Daniel and I reviewed another week of recordings. He paused on a frame showing volunteers quietly removing several portable signs from beside the landing strip. People do not usually remove signs unless they are worried someone else might read them, he observed. Then he closed his laptop and looked directly at me. I believe we have reached the point where other organizations are beginning to ask the same questions you asked on the first day. Once multiple independent reviews start at the same time, the answers become much harder for anyone to control. The following Tuesday began like every other morning until my phone rang before 7 o'clock. Daniel rarely called that early unless something important had happened. His voice was calm, but I could hear the satisfaction underneath it. We just received several responses to additional public records requests, he said. I think you should come to my office. 30 minutes later, I was sitting across from him as he spread several folders across the conference table. None of them contained dramatic headlines or shocking accusations. Instead, they contained something far more valuable, ordinary documents that fit together like pieces of a puzzle. One folder held meeting agendas from the Homeowners Association that referenced annual aviation events and runway maintenance budgets. Another contained invoices from landscaping contractors for mowing and grading the landing strip over multiple seasons. A third included promotional materials inviting residents to enjoy convenient fly-in access as one of the community's premium amenities. None of the documents claimed ownership directly, but every one of them assumed the association controlled the runway. Daniel tapped the stack lightly. They documented their own operation for years. As we continued reviewing the records, another unexpected development arrived. One of the pilots I had met at the diner several weeks earlier called my cell phone. He apologized for bothering me and explained that several pilots had recently started comparing notes after hearing questions about the property. He insisted they had always believed the Homeowners Association possessed full legal authority to operate the runway. Then he mentioned something neither Daniel nor I had previously heard. Every visiting pilot had been asked to complete a registration form before using the landing area. Those forms included emergency contact information, aircraft identification, and acknowledgement of community operating guidelines. The pilot still had copies of several completed forms because he routinely kept records of his flights. He offered to share them voluntarily. Daniel looked up as I ended the call and simply smiled. Independent witnesses with preserved records are extremely persuasive. Within 2 days, the pilot delivered copies exactly as promised. The forms listed the Homeowners Association by name, identified volunteer coordinators, and instructed visitors where to park after landing. They never mentioned my property because everyone involved apparently believed the runway belonged to the community. That misunderstanding was becoming increasingly important. It demonstrated that the pilots had relied on representations made by others rather than intentionally ignoring private ownership. Later that week, another surprise arrived through certified mail. Instead of another demand from Brenda, the envelope contained minutes from a recent Homeowners Association board meeting that had somehow reached Daniel through a lawful records request connected to community governance. One section summarized a discussion about increasing aviation participation during upcoming seasonal events. Another referred to concerns about recent survey activity near the runway. The final paragraph caught my attention immediately. It noted that legal counsel had recommended exploring alternative long-term access options if current property questions remained unresolved. I read the sentence twice before handing the document back to Daniel. "That sounds like they know they have a problem," I said quietly. He nodded. "It sounds like they have finally realized the documents do not support the assumptions they relied on." The atmosphere around the neighborhood began changing almost overnight. Weekend traffic became noticeably lighter. Several familiar aircraft stopped appearing altogether. Volunteers no longer placed decorative signs beside the runway, and the landscaping company that had maintained the field so regularly never returned. Even neighbors who had once spoken confidently about the convenience of the landing strip now seemed hesitant whenever the subject came up. One afternoon, I encountered an older resident while buying supplies at the local hardware store. After a few moments of uncomfortable conversation, he admitted that many homeowners had believed the runway sat on common property connected to the subdivision. They had never questioned it because every board meeting, every newsletter, and every community event treated it as an established fact. "Most of us assumed everything had been handled years ago," he confessed. Driving home, I realized something important. The dispute had never been fueled by a single dramatic lie. It had grown quietly through years of assumptions repeated often enough that they eventually sounded like facts. When I reached my farm, I noticed a county vehicle parked near the entrance to my western field. Two officials were examining survey markers while comparing printed maps with electronic tablets. They worked methodically, speaking very little, before taking photographs from several different angles. Neither one approached me, and I did not interrupt them. As they packed their equipment and drove away, Daniel called once again. "The independent reviews have definitely started," he said. "From this point forward, the evidence will not be gathered only by us. Other people are beginning to verify the same facts on their own, and that usually changes everything." By the time autumn settled across the valley, the runway looked busier in old photographs than it did in real life. The weekly activity that had once seemed constant had slowed to only a handful of arrivals, and even those pilots appeared cautious. Several circled overhead before landing, while others taxied only briefly before departing again. Word had clearly spread that questions were being asked, even if most people still did not know the full story. Daniel finally told me it was time to move from documenting facts to presenting them. Instead of rushing into court the moment I discovered the runway, we now had months of surveys, certified records, aerial photographs, security footage, maintenance invoices, newsletters, registration forms, witness statements, and public documents that all pointed toward the same conclusion. None of the evidence depended on speculation because nearly every important fact had been created by the Homeowners Association itself. The formal filing was submitted quietly on a Wednesday morning. There were no television cameras outside the courthouse and no dramatic speeches. The complaint simply asked the court to recognize the undisputed property boundaries, address the unauthorized use of private land, and consider the financial impact of years of commercial-style operations conducted without the owner's permission. Daniel reminded me that courts appreciated organized facts far more than emotional arguments, so every exhibit followed a clear timeline beginning with my purchase of the farm and ending with the most recent documented landing. A few days later, Brenda requested a meeting through her attorney. Daniel advised that we attend, but speak very little. The conference took place in a neutral office with everyone seated around a long wooden table. Brenda looked noticeably different from our first conversation beside the runway. She still wore expensive clothing and carried herself with confidence, but the certainty that had once filled every sentence had faded. Her attorney began by suggesting that the disagreement resulted from historical misunderstandings rather than intentional conduct. Daniel responded by placing 3 documents on the table. The first was the certified survey confirming the runway sat entirely on my property. The second was the Homeowners Association letter asking me to recognize continued use of the runway. The third was a collection of association records describing runway maintenance over multiple years. No one argued with the authenticity of any document. After several minutes of silence, Brenda quietly admitted that the board had relied on information passed down from previous leadership without independently verifying property ownership. That statement explained how the situation had continued for years, but it did not change what the records showed. The meeting ended without an agreement because too many important questions remained unresolved. As we walked toward the parking lot, Daniel turned to me and said, "Today was important for one reason. Nobody challenged the property line." Over the following weeks, additional information continued arriving through ordinary legal procedures. Financial records showed that aviation-related community events had generated revenue through membership activities connected to the runway. Maintenance contracts confirmed repeated work performed on the landing strip over several seasons. Several longtime residents voluntarily provided written statements explaining they had honestly believed the area belonged to the homeowners association because that was how it had always been described during community meetings. Their honesty reinforced something I had realized long before. Most of the neighbors were not trying to take someone else's property. They had simply trusted the people leading their community. As the hearing date approached, the atmosphere around the neighborhood became noticeably quieter. The windsock disappeared from the edge of the field. Portable markers were removed. Weekend aviation events stopped appearing on community calendars. My security cameras recorded long stretches of empty grass where airplanes had once landed almost every weekend. Standing at the edge of the western field one evening, I looked across the same stretch of land where my confusion had begun months earlier. The silence felt different now. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the calm that comes after every important question has been answered with documents instead of assumptions. Then Daniel called with the final update before our hearing. "The court has completed its preliminary review," he said. "The judge wants both sides to focus almost entirely on the written evidence because the ownership records appear remarkably consistent. After everything we have collected, the facts are finally speaking for themselves." The hearing itself was nothing like the dramatic courtroom scenes people often imagine. There were no shocking interruptions, no emotional speeches, and no unexpected confessions. Instead, there were maps, certified surveys, recorded deeds, dated photographs, maintenance invoices, meeting minutes, security footage, and months of carefully organized evidence placed into a timeline that anyone could follow from beginning to end. Daniel presented each document with the same calm confidence he had shown from the day he first told me to be patient. Every piece supported the next one until the entire story became impossible to separate from the facts. The certified survey established the property boundaries. The county records confirmed ownership. The security cameras documented continuous use of the runway. The maintenance invoices showed that the homeowners association had actively managed the landing strip. The newsletters promoted aviation events. The registration forms demonstrated that visiting pilots had been directed there by the association. Even Brenda's own letter asking me to recognize continued use of the runway quietly acknowledged that my signature was necessary if they wanted lawful access moving forward. When the judge asked whether either side disputed the legal property line shown in the certified survey, the answer was simple. No one did. From that point forward, the discussion focused on responsibility rather than ownership, because ownership was no longer in question. Brenda spoke respectfully throughout the hearing. She explained that successive boards had relied on information inherited from previous leadership and that many residents genuinely believed the runway belonged to the community. Listening to her, I realized she was probably telling the truth about that part. Assumptions had been repeated for so many years that they eventually sounded like established facts. Unfortunately, assumptions do not replace recorded deeds. After reviewing the evidence, the court confirmed that the entire landing strip was located on my private property and that continued use required my authorization. The parties were directed to resolve the remaining financial issues through the legal process using the documented evidence already presented. Walking out of the courthouse, I did not feel victorious in the way I had imagined months earlier. I mostly felt relieved. The uncertainty that had started with the sound of an airplane landing in my field was finally over. During the following weeks, the temporary markers disappeared permanently. The remaining equipment was removed in an orderly manner, and the western field slowly began looking like farmland again instead of an improvised airport. I hired a local contractor to restore the compacted soil before reseeding the area with grass suitable for agricultural use. By the following spring, fresh green growth covered the old runway, so evenly that someone visiting for the first time would never have guessed airplanes had once landed there almost every weekend. One evening, I stood on the same porch where I had dropped my coffee months earlier when I heard that first engine overhead. The sunset stretched across the valley in shades of orange and gold while a light breeze moved through the newly restored field. An airplane passed high above on its way somewhere else, but it never descended. It remained exactly where it belonged, crossing the sky instead of my property. I smiled because the silence that followed sounded different than it ever had before. It sounded earned. Looking back, I learned that protecting property is rarely about shouting the loudest or acting the fastest. It is about knowing the facts, respecting the law, staying patient when emotions run high, and allowing clear evidence to speak louder than assumptions. If I had reacted in anger on that first morning, I might have lost the opportunity to build the case that ultimately resolved everything. Instead, one document at a time, one photograph at a time, and one ordinary day at a time, the truth became impossible to ignore. Now I would love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you discovered strangers had been using your land for years without your knowledge? Share your opinion in the comments because I always enjoy reading your perspective. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about property disputes, determination, and unexpected turns, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next story waiting just around the corner.